What's up, Tumnad lectures? In this video, we are going to be talking about what we call the gastric gland. Let's go ahead and get started. And now we need to know what is the gastric gland. You're going to be having these structures within one of the most important layers of what we call the stomach. And the stomach has 4 layers. It has the innermost, which we call the mucosa. We have what we call the submucosa. We have what we call the muscularis externa, and then we have what we call the serosa. Now, these gastric glands are going to be residing within the innermost layer, which we call the mucosa. Let's go ahead and get started and look at all the kind of the cells that are going to be making up this structure we are calling the gastric gland. Now, this gland is going to be containing a lot of cells. So we need to know how do we call all those cells and what are some of those kind of substances which are going to be coming off from those kind of these cells. Okay. So now some of these cells are going to be producing their secretions into the stomach, while some of these cells are going to be producing their substances in blood, and of course they're going to be part of what we call the enteroendocrine cells. Okay. So now when you see the whole of these cells here, these cells are super very important. You know how they are called? These cells are what we call the surface, the surface mucus, surface mucus cells. Okay, and they're going to be providing the mucus, which is going to be having glycoprotein like mucin, and even also rich in what we call the bicarbonate, to make sure that they make that thick mucus layer that protects from what we call hydrochloric acid from corroding what we call the epithelium or what we call the stomach. Okay. Now we also have these kind of these cells here. How do we call these kind of these cells? These cells here are what we call the mucus, mucus neck cells. Okay, these cells are also very important in producing mucus and even also what we call the bicarbonate, to make sure that we make the thick mucus a barrier that protects the stomach wall from being digested by what we call hydrochloric acid. They are such beautiful cells. Okay. Then as we come down here, we also have these kind of these cells. These cells are super very important in production of what we call hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. You know how these cells are called? These cells here are what we call the parietal, the parietal cells. Okay? Are what we call the parietal cells. Another name for these parietal cells is what we call the oxyntic cells. Okay? Is what we call the oxyntic cells. So if you don't want to call them the parietal cells, you call them the oxyntic cells. They produce hydrochloric acid and even also what we call the intrinsic factor that aids in the absorption of vitamin B12. Okay, it is also such another beautiful thing. Now we also have these kind of these cells here. These cells, they're going to be producing what we call pepsinogen and even also what we call the gastric lipase. You know how these cells are called? Are what we call the chief cells. Okay, are what we call the chief cells. Another name for these chief cells is what we call the peptic cells. Okay, they can also be called the peptic. They can also be called the peptic cells. There is also another name. Another name can also be called the what we call the zymogenic name. So now these cells are going to be having a couple of different names. They produce what we call gastric lipase and even also what we call pepsinogen that gets converted into pepsin by the influence of hydrochloric acid to start the process of chemical digestion of proteins. It is also such another beautiful thing. Okay. Then as we move down here, we have this kind of this cell. This cell is going to be exerting an inhibitory effect in what we call gastric secretions. This cell is very much powerful inhibitor of gastric secretion. You know how this cell is called? This cell are going super concentrated in what we call the pyloric antrum. This cell is what we call the D cell. Okay, is what we call the D cell. And these cells are going to be producing a molecule. They're going to be producing a molecule called somatostatin. Okay, and this somatostatin is going to be one of the most inhibitor of what we call parietal cells from producing hydrochloric acid, and even also an influence on the chief cells from producing what we call the pepsinogen. So now this somatostatin is a powerful inhibitor of gastric secretion. We shall look at these D cells, how it does the process of inhibiting gastric secretion during the study of what we call gastric secretion during what we call the gastric phase of gastric secretion. So now the D cells are super very important. They are sensitive to whenever there is too much of the hydrochloric acid in the stomach. That's when they are stimulated to go and to release the somatostatin that blocks the parietal cells from producing hydrochloric acid. They are such a beautiful cells in what we call the pyloric antrum. Okay, then We also have these kind of D cells that are super very important. They produce a molecule called gastrin that has an influence on producing, stimulating the parietal cells and the chief cells to produce their own secretions. You know how these cells are called? These cells are just simply called the G cells. Okay, they are just simply called the G cells, and they produce a molecule called the gastrin. Okay, they produce a molecule called gastrin that flows into the blood and goes and then stimulate what we call the parietal cells and the chief cells to produce hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen respectively. These G cells are also super very important. They are so much residing in what we call the pyloric antrum of the stomach. Such another beautiful thing, okay? Then we also have this space within this kind of these cells. How do we call this space? Whereby the parietal cells, the chief cells, the mucus cells, all of them are going to producing their substances in this kind of space. How do we call this space? This space is what we call the lumen of the gland. Okay, is what we call the gastric. What we call the gastric gland. What we call the gastric gland lumen. Okay. So now the G cells, the D cells, they are enteroendocrine cells. Their secretions power direct into the blood. They are not part of the gastric secretions, okay? We only have this, the secretions from the surface mucus cells, the mucus neck cells, the parietal cells, and then the chief cells, that their content gets stored into the lumen of this gland, and they get moved into what we call this space. You know how we call this kind of this space? Super very important, that allows the movement of this kind of the secretions into the gastric lumen. How do we call this kind of this space? This tube is what we call the gastric pit. Okay, this is what we call the gastric pit. Super very important. That's going to be allowing these kind of the secretions to flow into the gastric lumen to go and do their different functions. Okay. Then we also have this kind of other enteroendocrine cell. This kind of the enteroendocrine cell is going to be producing one of the powerful stimulator of the gastric secretion. You know how this cell is called? This cell is what we call the enterochromaffin-like cell. Okay, is what we call enterochromaffin-like cell. Okay, now these cells are super very important. You know what they produce? They produce a molecule called histamine, and histamine goes in blood and then goes and stimulates the parietal cells to produce hydrochloric acid. They go even and stimulate the chief cells to produce what we call pepsinogen. So now the enterochromaffin cell are such a beautiful cell in producing histamine, which is a powerful stimulator of what we call the gastric secretion. So now this one, they produce a molecule called the histamine. Okay. And then the last kind of this cell, which is super very important, you have this kind of this cell. These cells are what we call enterochromaffin cells. Now, these ones are enterochromaffin-like cells, and these ones are just enterochromaffin cells. These cells, they produce a molecule called serotonin. Okay, they produce a molecule called serotonin. Okay, so now, and of course, serotonin is going to be having an influence in what we call the motility within the GIT. Super very important. Okay, so now having just a very simple quick recap, we have what we call the mucus cells and the mucus neck cells that together produce mucus having a protein mucin, that's and even also what we call the bicarbonate that together forms what we call the thick mucus barrier that enhance protecting the mucus epithelium from being corroded by the hydrochloric acid. We have what we call the parietal cells, which can also be called the extrinsic cells that produce hydrochloric acid, and even also what we call the intrinsic factor. The intrinsic factor coming from the parietal cells is going to be enhancing in absorption of vitamin B12. That's going to be aiding. That's going to be one of the most important substances in the synthesis of what we call the red blood cells. So now, if you don't have the intrinsic factor, you're going to be lacking what we call the vitamin B12, and of course that one will lead into the type of the anemia which we call the pernicious anemia. We also have these chief cells that are going to be producing what we call the pepsinogen that quickly gets converted into pepsin by the influence of the hydrochloric acid. Pepsin is going to be aiding what we call chemical digestion of the protein. Super very important. Another molecule coming from the chief cells is what we call the gastric lipase that aids in the chemical digestion of what we call the fats in the stomach. Super very important. We also have what we call the enteroendocrine cell, which is what one we're calling the D cell. They produce a molecule called somatostatin, which is a powerful inhibitor of what we call gastric secretion, especially during the gastric phase of the gastric secretion. It is such another beautiful thing, okay? We also have this kind of these cells that are going to be residing mainly in what we call the pyloric antrum. These cells, what we call the G cell, that produces a molecule called the gastrin that flows into the blood and goes and then stimulate the parietal cell chief cells to produce their secretions. This one is one of the most important stimulator of what we call gastric secretion. And then the secretion for surface mucus cells, mucous neck cell, parietal cells, the chief cells, when they flow in this kind of this the gastric gland lumen. From there, they move into this kind of this space which we call the gastric pit, and then into what we call the gastric lumen. Okay, so now this one is going to be the lumen of the gland. Okay. Then we also have this kind of the other enteroendocrine cells. These ones here, they're what we call enterochromaffin-like cells. They produce what we call histamine that goes and stimulate what we call the parietal cells by what we call the G stimulatory, a pathway leading into what we call synthesis of hydrochloric acid. Okay. Then we also have this kind of these cells which are calling the enterochromaffin cells that are going to be producing what we call serotonin. Okay. So now this covers the gastric gland. Thank you very much for watching. Tumnad as always. Until we meet next time.